This really happened to me, and sometimes I still can't believe I lived through it. I am an old woman by the standards of most YouTube storytellers, a widowed bookseller in Seattle who wears the same wool cardigan all winter and keeps the heat low because the furnace rattles like a broken xylophone. And what I'm about to tell you is the truest and strangest story of my life. The DNA report arrived during dessert at the pink door on Post Alley, while the powdered cocoa on the tiramisu still clung to the edge of my spoon, and the violinist in the corner was tuning his G-string. My daughter, Dahlia, 30 years old, glossy dark hair that she always tucks behind one ear like a habit she learned from me, glanced at her phone, stood up so fast her chair screeched across the tile, and said loud enough that the table of tourists from Boise turned to look, "Stop calling me Mom." The band went silent. The waiter hovering with espresso paused, a tiny ceramic cup steaming in his hand, as if heat itself had taken offense. She laid the phone down between the plates, a digital document open like a naked blade, and I felt the air thin in my chest as if the restaurant had been hoisted up into the Cascades and left there to freeze. She was looking at me the way one looks at a stranger who has sat down in the wrong seat on the wrong flight. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. That night had been my idea. I'm the one who made the reservation at the Pink Door a week ahead, who brought the little gold foil 30 that the hostess kindly taped to the edge of our booth, the one who told the waiter, in a whisper only half sotto voce, that my daughter loved tiramisu, and would they please add a sparkler? It felt, until that moment, like the right place for the flourish of a grown child's new decade. The trapeze rig above the bar, the lady in white feathers practicing backstage somewhere, the brick walls with their dramatic murals, the buzz of everyone believing they'd chosen the right evening to be alive. We were 5 at that table. Me, my daughter, her fiancé Logan, my younger sister Elena, and Elena's husband, a patient, quiet man named Thomas who eats the same thing wherever he goes, which in this case meant the lasagna, folded like a love letter. Logan had insisted on paying. He'd recently sold his second startup, a dull fintech thing with an incendiary valuation, and had behaved with clumsy generosity all evening, ordering oysters and a Brunello, and then trying to pronounce burrata as if his tongue carried a visa for everywhere. He is the type of man whose watch announces his taste before his mouth does, rose gold face, band like a belt on a racing thoroughbred. He tapped his glass and everyone did that awful wedding thing of pretending the future needs an audience, and, when the plates were cleared, I felt it happening. That chord I get sometimes in my chest, when love is a little too loud in a place where strangers can hear it. Dahlia did not drink much. She never has. A glass of red wine half finished, always. She smiled at the sparkler on the tiramisu and rolled her eyes but laughed, because she has always been kind to me, and I heard the violinist ease into something old and sentimental that made the older couple sway in their chairs. Then her phone buzzed. If you were to ask me later how any of this began, I would tell you it started years ago with a quiet question disguised as nothing at all, a pediatrician at Swedish on First Hill pointing at a chart and saying, "Oh, negative, Mom?" and Dad, and me saying, "A positive, both of us," and him pausing with the care of a man who sells cheaper truths to parents for a living, then moving on. My husband, Paul, was still alive then, alive and infinitely capable of shrugging away tiny, disloyal facts. If I leaned on a memory long enough, it would blur like a person seen through rain on a bus window. But that moment stayed sharp. Our blood types, Dahlia's blood type. I filed it in the small drawer in my mind where I put things that don't fit but might never matter. I wanted to say 1,000 mother things in that restaurant. What does the email say, honey? Put your phone away. This is not the time. But my throat had gone dry, and Logan, blessed with the same relentless momentum as his bank account, said softly, "Babe?" He reached for her elbow like he always did, his claim staked out with 2 fingers, and a proprietary smile. Dahlia pulled her arm back. "It's a lab result," she said. "The one you refused to do with me last month." I had refused. That was true. I am a stubborn old mule when I believe in principle over prudence, and my refusal then had not been because I feared a result, but because the test had been suggested by Logan during a fight about wedding seating arrangements, where to put my sister, who hates his mother with the kind of intensity usually reserved for mountain climbers and saints, and it had felt like a dare disguised as a clinical curiosity. "We'll just do the full DNA package," he had said lightly, as if we were choosing towels to monogram. "It could be fun. Who are we anyway?" And something in me said no. I told Dahlia it was silly. She told me it wasn't about me, and went ahead. Now she dragged her finger across her screen, and even without reading I understood the architecture of the thing. The neat percentages, the names of distant strangers, the little circles connecting, the mother line where my name should have been and wasn't. I did not say, because I did not want to be the woman who says such things and then has to stand in the wreckage, "Show me." I only watched her face. "Stop calling me Mom," she said again, her voice smaller this time because she was no longer playing to the gallery. "I want you to stop." The violinist looked at the floor. Somewhere a cork popped and people clapped, and the sound landed on our table like confetti made of pebbles. Elena said my name, 3 little syllables that have always belonged to her mouth more than mine, Nora, and I reached blindly for the espresso, as if something hot could solve cold facts. It burned my lip, and I put the cup down, and the waiter, with the muscle memory of 100,000 calamities, appeared with water. There are kinds of betrayal that announce themselves like thunderstorms across the sound, and then there are those that arrive as a quiet drizzle and never end. The first time I felt like I had been made a fool by the universe, it was when Paul died, not quickly like a romantic, but slowly like an accountant, in a medical bed in our house in Ballard, inventorying each remaining cell and sending it out like a moth. I thought I already knew the taxonomy of loss, but I had never imagined this, my daughter's voice slicing the definitive word out of me in public, handing it back. Mom. I did not cry there. I have always been the kind of woman who refuses to give strangers a reason to think they know me. I waited until we were outside, where Post Alley smelled like wet stone and garlic and the ocean's patience, and I said, "Dahlia, sweetheart, please, let's go home and we'll talk." Logan had his hand on her shoulder again. They matched in a certain way that had always softened me against my better instincts, dark hair, those knife-boned faces. My daughter's mouth trembled like a lie she hated. "It says you're not my mother," she whispered. "And if you knew and didn't tell me, if you knew, Nora." "I didn't," I said, and even saying my own name felt like crime scene tape. "I didn't know." She looked at me then with an expression I have only ever seen on the faces of the newly betrayed, a hunger for a story that could make the impossible become a misunderstanding. "Then how?" she asked. "You come to understand when you live long enough that every life has a couple of loose threads. You don't tug, because you aren't ready to see what the sweater is made of. Mine were winter threads. The night I delivered Dahlia, a whiteout had bullied its way into Puget Sound. Swedish First Hill had diverted expectant mothers because of a power issue, so my obstetrician rerouted us down to Tacoma General. Paul drove us along I-5 with the hazard lights on, and his jaw set like a man in a bad movie. And when I tell people the only thing I remember clearly is the orange glare of the exit sign for 705, they smile politely, but it's true. We delivered at dawn, a nurse with a lopsided name tag, her name close enough to Margie that my brain finished it, took the baby while I slept like a thing saved from drowning. They brought my girl back to me swaddled like a burrito and stamped with a footprint, and I never thought to say, "Before I stitch myself back together, could you please certify the entire world?" We gathered our coats. Elena slipped her arm through mine. Thomas, bless him, paid the bill, while Logan was still Googling something that I imagine was chain of custody legal DNA Washington State, or how to weaponize truth without looking like a monster. It was raining properly now, and the line outside the gum wall had thinned to the brave, their cameras held up like an apology for everything. My daughter stood a little apart, her phone in her hand like the only friend who would never lie. At home, the narrow gray house on NW 64th, where Paul and I raised her and the lilacs refused to die, we sat at the kitchen table as if we were new to chairs. The house smelled like the cinnamon I had sprinkled on her morning oatmeal for years, like old books and a stubborn draft. She put the phone between us, a glass slab that reflected our faces like a cruel funhouse. "Okay," I said, because I wanted to locate the ground. "We know what this says. We also know the night you were born was not normal. We know there were strange little anomalies." I gave her the blood type story, and she flinched like I'd thrown a pebble at her favorite window. "You once told me you hated peas, and then I learned that your father hated peas too, and you two were always in league on that. We are not bound by peas or blood. We are bound by—" I stopped. She was staring at the window, where the rain made the world look like it was running very fast in place. "Mothers don't lie," she said. "Some do," I said gently. "I never did." "You didn't tell me what you didn't know," she said. "Maybe that's worse." Logan cleared his throat. "There are pathways," he said, "to clarity and closure here." He is a man who has built a career on pretending certainty can be purchased in monthly plans. "Chain of custody tests, court orders. We can compel the hospital to produce records." "We have no reason to escalate, Vatal," I said, with a smile I use on vendors who try to upcharge me for plywood bookcases. "We have reason to investigate. It is a strange thing to feel resolve growing in you while the person you love most is inching away like a tide." I took out a legal pad. There is always a legal pad in my kitchen. Widows know that lists are the scaffolding of sanity, and wrote Tacoma General, birth records, Nurse Margie, blood type, Swedish pediatrician name. I drew boxes like a detective on television and kept my handwriting neat, as if neatness could convince reality to be simple. Elena, leaning in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands like a flag of truce, said, "I remember that snowstorm. I called the house every hour and the line was busy. I thought Paul had left it off the hook. I gave him hell about it for years." Paul is dead 5 winters now, an absence as solid as a stone wall you can warm your back on. The dead are such terrible accessories to a brand new crisis. They cannot be corrected. They cannot apologize. They cannot even show up and make a scene. If there was an answer buried in his chest, it is compost now under my lilacs. "We start with records," I said. "Hospitals have them. Nurses have licensing boards. Names leave trails." Logan looked like he wanted to be the CEO of our grief. "And therapists," he added. "Everyone will need a therapist." He put his hand on Dahlia's back again, as if he were her spine. She did not shrug him off this time. For all my talk, I did not sleep that night. I am an old crow, perched at the window at 3 a.m., glaring at the hollow black of the street, my mind picking at shiny bits of memory. I made coffee at 4, opened the shop, Agnes and Ink, on Ballard Avenue, wedged between a shop that sells artisanal honey and a hair salon where no one is older than 30, and paced among the paperbacks until I thought I'd wear a path in the floorboards. When the city became human again, I dialed Tacoma General and discovered, as all citizens do, that institutions install gatekeepers who never sleep. HIPAA, transfers, archived records accessed through an online portal that required passwords I did not have. I wrote down medical records request and vital statistics as if writing them could open the door. By noon, I had the first tremble of a thread. A woman named Margot Witt, who had been a nurse in labor and delivery in 1995. The nurse at the desk gave me that little tell of the overly helpful. Silence, followed by a very precise spelling. She's retired now, the nurse said. Lives on Bainbridge, I think. She said it quickly, like a child sneaking candy. I shouldn't, she added and stopped. Bainbridge Island is a ferry ride and 1,000 metaphors away from Seattle. Lush, expensive, quiet in that lawyerly way of expensive communities where every problem has a long driveway to hide down. I had been once, years ago, to a fundraiser at the Museum of Art, where they served salmon on cedar, and the women wore scarves like the flags of invented countries. I could see Margot there, a retired nurse with expensive opinions, cutting her smoked salmon into precise squares. I called Elena and said, "Do you feel like a fairy this afternoon?" And because I sounded like myself again, she said, "I'll drive. If you want to know what the sound of resolve is, it is a fairy horn in the gray of a Tuesday, low and certain, a thing that announces we're leaving what we know and heading toward what we will wish we didn't." The water was as flat as a mirror that had decided to stop being vain. Elena drove with both hands on the wheel because she has always been careful since we were girls, and she crashed our father's pickup into a sweet gum tree, and he said one quiet sentence that took 5 years to stop echoing. The Olympic Mountains were smudges on a child's drawing. We arrived on Bainbridge and parked under a cedar that dripped patient rain onto the hood. I had found an address, the kind of place where the gravel in the driveway has opinions. The house had a view down a slope to the water and a white ceramic goose on the porch like a joke about taste. I am brave once and then I am not. This has always been my rhythm. I knocked and prepared my face in the worst way, like a woman expecting to be told she is wrong and dangerous. The door opened and there she was, a woman in her 70s with the careful haircut of someone who has a standing appointment, eyes as light as old sea glass, a posture that said she had told 1,000 exhausted women to breathe, and had meant it. Her mouth thinned when she saw me. Not surprise, recognition. "You took your time," she said, not kindly. "I'm looking for Margot Witt," I said, though it seemed we both knew. "You found her," she said. She glanced at Elena and then at me again, reading my face the way nurses do. "You must be Nora." It felt like my tongue fell through the floor. "How?" "I've been waiting 29 years, she cut in, and stepped back to let us in. On the console table in her hallway was a photograph in a silver frame, a newborn with a hospital cap, mouth open mid-cry, and a little card tucked beside it that read, in tidy cursive, "Baby girl, 8:04 a.m., footprint taken." The frame faced the door like a mirror that knows secrets. I smelled coffee. I heard a television in another room, muted to a whisper that sounded like the sea in one shell. I took a step inside, the kind people take when they think they might be stepping into their own past. Margot closed the door and turned the lock. Then she faced me squarely, like a woman stepping under oath. "You're here because your daughter told you to stop calling her mom," she said, "and you're here because you got the DNA result I used to pray would never exist." "What did you do?" I asked, because I believe in a grammar of civility, even when the house is on fire. "What happened?" She shook her head once, a barely perceptible movement that carried more history than 100 books. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was bigger than me. It was all of us, and none of us. It was money." She looked at the photograph on the table as if it were a compass that had told her the wrong north. "You should sit down, Nora, because the woman who carried your child out of that recovery room wasn't supposed to be on shift at all that morning, and the man who made sure she was, he has a wing at Tacoma General, named after him now." My knees went weak in the expensive way hardwood floors can make you feel fragile. Elena caught my elbow. On the coffee table was a folder with an old hospital logo on it and a smaller, newer envelope stamped with the words, "Washington State Department of Health, Vital Records." I reached for the folder, and Margot put her hand flat on it, stopping me with the power of a person who has said, "Don't push," to women in transition for 4 decades. "Listen first," she said, "because if you open that before I explain, you'll burn down whatever's left standing in you." Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, as if the weather were leaning closer to here. Margot looked from me to Elena and back again, then took a breath, the kind that belongs to a person who has carried a confession for so long it has grown bones. "There was a switch," she said, "but not the accident you think. It was arranged, and the family who arranged it still lives on this island." I felt my hand slide off the folder like a person slipping on black ice. "Arranged by whom?" I asked, but my voice did not sound like mine. Margot lifted her chin toward the window, where across the gray water the lights of Seattle were beginning to come on, indifferent and beautiful. "By the man whose name is carved above the hospital's atrium," she said, "and by the woman he kept in a condominium near the courthouse on Broadway. Your daughter was currency, Nora, and I was the cashier." She looked down at her hand on the folder, then up at me with a narrowing of the eyes that could have cut glass. "Do you still want to see what's inside?" I had not known until that moment how strong my hands could be when they were busy not shaking. I took them off the folder like a person putting down a weapon and folded them in my lap. "Tell me everything," I said, and when I heard my own voice, I felt a small, savage pride. I sounded like those widows in old movies who ring their own doorbell so they can answer the door with a straight back. Margot did not dramatize. She told it like a chart note. The storm, the diversion to Tacoma General, the chaos of half-staffed night shift, the woman in the condominium on Broadway, Sylvia Hart, who came in with a high-risk pregnancy, and a patron who had given the hospital enough money to rewire half the NICU. The baby who didn't cry when she came, and the baby who did, down the hall in a recovery room attended by a nurse too new to know how bargaining worked. The deal brokered between an L&D manager who now lives in Arizona and a foundation officer who insisted his hands had never touched a crib. The new bracelets slipped onto small ankles at dawn, the old ones dropped in a trash bin and carried out with the morning's linens, a signature that didn't match itself. Cashier was not a failure of metaphor. She had literally run the ledger of favors. People think hospitals are cathedrals, but hospitals are supermarkets. Things get scanned. Sometimes the wrong price comes up, and someone with a key flicks it down. "And you kept quiet for almost 30 years, Elena said. Her voice was the old rough wool I remember from childhood when she got the last word on some family injustice, and then held it like a coat against the rain. Watching my sister raise a child who wasn't born to her. Watching some mistress feed a baby who was. That baby died, Margot said, and when I looked up, her eyes were wet but hard. The one who didn't cry. She died within an hour, and I told myself, that you wouldn't want that knowledge, Nora, that whoever you were asleep, and you would never forgive me, but forgiveness is a luxury I was willing to forfeit. I've written a confession 100 times. I've mailed it to myself. I've started it on a typewriter like I thought the right noise would make it truer. And every time I'm interrupted by something stupid, a delivery, a neighbor, a cat wanting food, and the interruptions became my excuse. "Why tell me now?" I asked. She glanced at the phone on her mantel, an old rotary that wouldn't take a picture if you begged it. "Because 2 weeks ago, a young man with a careful haircut came to my door and told me, with all the politeness money can buy, that if anyone came asking questions, I should refer them to a lawyer in a building on Madison Street, and I am too old to be told where to send my guilt. Logan," I said, like a person who has realized the water they drink has a taste. Of course he knew which doors to knock on, which ghosts to bribe, which stories to keep on a leash until he needed content. Of course the DNA test hadn't been a curiosity. It had been a fuse. Margot nodded once, and that small movement contained enough indictment to light a city block. He said his investors were adjacent, that Mr. Kincaid's family office had participated in his last round, and that everybody wanted the cleanest possible outcome. He smelled like a department store. Elena made a sound in her throat that was halfway between a laugh and a noun the law forbids on network television. So the fiancé is in the pocket of the man with his name on a hospital atrium, she said. Of course. Margot moved her hand off the folder with the reluctance of someone unhooking a necklace that had kept her upright for years. Here, she said. It's copies, shift logs, a whitewashed incident report, a donation pledge that posts the week after you delivered for an amount that would smooth a conscience the way a pillow is smoothed for a dying man, and a note I wrote to myself with a name on it. She looked at me and did not blink. Your biological daughter's name is Sloan. Sloan Hart. They moved to Bainbridge when she was 7. She's a special education teacher in Bremerton now. She is kind. I did not open the folder. I held it like a kind of fever and looked out the window at the low, gray water, and something in me, the part that cooks oatmeal and picks up stray pennies and writes things on legal pads in a neat hand, climbed up, shook itself dry, and got to work. I have a daughter, I said. I have 2 daughters. Saying the second one didn't hurt. It felt like a tooth you'd worried with your tongue until it finally came loose and your mouth arranged itself around the gap with a strange joy. I sat there long enough for the light to change, then stood and asked Margot for a pen. On the back of the manila folder, I wrote names: Kincaid, Hart, Tacoma General, Broadway, Jarvis and Peel, because that was the kind of name a law firm like his would have. For good measure, I added AG's office, because if there is a woman who knows where a state keeps its mercy, it is the woman who works the phones in a prosecutor's lobby. Are you going to burn them? Margot asked softly. The people who did this? I used to think I didn't have it in me, I said. But as it turns out, I'm exactly the age when you stop apologizing for gasoline. The war was not cinematic. It was paper. It was phones that rang and rang. It was email subject lines so dry you'd think no lives were buried underneath. Follow up on records request, 1995 L&D. It was a clerk at Vital Records who recognized the name of the L&D manager and said, when she thought she was on mute, "Oh, for God's sake," and then came back and apologized like a child. It was a chain of custody DNA test this time, not the living room kit in a pastel box. And it was me and Dahlia sitting side by side at a lab in South Lake Union, rolling our cheeks with swabs like we'd both been dared to put our faces in a snowbank. It was a courier signing for a blood draw like it was a cake. Logan tried to insert himself, and Dahlia told him very quietly to go home. He called a car like his legs had forgotten their job. The villain's power arrived in cream paper envelopes with letterheads that made the printer ink feel expensive. We represent Mr. and Mrs. Graham Kincaid and the Kincaid Family Foundation, the first one began, a syllabic swagger that felt like someone clearing their throat into my mailbox. They invited me to consider more constructive pathways and suggested mediation to guard against reputational harm for all parties. They cited statutes like charms hung from a bracelet. They used phrases like alleged actions and if such a sequence of events occurred at all. They CEC'd a partner I looked up and found on a page of pictures where all the men's ties were navy. I have run a bookshop through Amazon, through rent hikes, through a pandemic that put hand sanitizer under my cash register and fear into every interaction. I have taken inventory with a fever and wrapped Christmas gifts while crying because Paul's chair was empty and I couldn't decide if I wanted to move it or sit in it. I do not frighten easily anymore. I made copies of the letters and fed them to a file folder labeled Kincaid Threats. And on a day when the clouds pressed low enough to rest their chins on the tops of the buildings, I walked to the King County Courthouse on 3rd Avenue and spoke to a woman at a window with a grace that belongs only to public servants who have seen strangers try to save themselves and do not roll their eyes. She told me what form to fill out to petition for access to sealed medical records in the event of suspected fraud. She wrote the number on a post-it with neat, slanted handwriting. "We see some things you wouldn't believe," she said softly. "I'm glad you brought a folder." The hospital tried to stonewall until the Seattle Times called. I will not pretend I was the one who found the reporter. That credit belongs to Elena, Who knows a woman whose son played soccer with a copy desk editor's nephew? The story took a shape I approved of. Not sensational, not cruel, even to Margot. It put names in print: Kincaid, Hart, jarred like jam on bread, and once names are in print, paper trails get shy about being shredded. The hospital called a press conference to announce an internal review. The Kincaid Family Foundation issued a statement about its deep, abiding commitment to maternal health. I printed it and took a red pen to it and circled abiding, because people who say abiding are trying to make you think their money is older than it is. The DNA results came back on a Friday at 4:12 p.m., a time the world chooses to break you only if it intends to watch you do your weekend grocery shopping with a new face. There was a heavy envelope and a phone call, and the woman on the line had a voice like a hallway, empty and echoing, with places for you to stand if you needed a minute. "There is a 0% probability of maternity," she said carefully, "between you and the subject known as Dahlia." She pronounced my daughter's name with great tenderness, as if she believed names could cushion. "And there is a 99.99% probability of maternity between the subject known as Sylvia Hart and the subject known as Dahlia." She exhaled. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know that's more than a number." I hung up. I walked in circles in the back room of the shop until the dust got ideas. Then I called the other number, the one for the woman in Bremerton whose face I had memorized on a social media page Margot had found with the kind of quiet, stalking women of a certain age learn when a thing must be learned. Sloane answered on the fourth ring. Her voice sounded like mine did when I was 30 and had not yet learned to fear Tuesday. "I think we belong to each other," I said. The sentence came out so simply that I could have cried for all the paragraphs I had wasted on preparing for eloquence. "But I won't make you meet me. I will wait as long as you need." She was quiet so long, I wondered if the ocean had eaten the phone line. Then she said, "My mother reads to me over the phone sometimes. Not my mother who raised me, the other one. She called last night and read me a poem about lighthouses. She said she didn't know why." She swallowed. "Do you like lighthouses?" "I own one," I said, "made of paper, in a book. But I could like the real kind if you wanted me to." We met 3 days later at Cary Park on Queen Anne, like tourists. The view was showing off, the Space Needle doing its favorite trick, the mountain pretending to be a god's shoulder in the late light. She walked toward me in a blue coat and stopped and smiled, and my knees remembered a particular ache from 1995. I did not reach out the way movies say you should. We stood there and made the shape of a new kind of line, one that didn't require signatures or blood, just bravery. "Hi," I said. "I'm Nora." And then, with no shame, I said, "I am afraid." She nodded. "Me too." We sat on the low wall and made space for someone who hadn't arrived yet. "Dahlia?" she asked, and I told her the truth, that my girl was furious and silent in the way that is healthiest for some kinds of grief, that she was sleeping at Elena's and seeing a therapist near Green Lake who specialized in complicated attachment, a phrase I Googled and then put into my pocket like a stone that knows you are lonely. I told her that Logan had tried to negotiate on behalf of no one but himself, and that Dahlia had given him back his ring on the Guames Island ferry, which felt like poetry, even if the captain didn't know he was the witness in a stanza. "He told her he'd help get the story behind a paywall," I said dryly. "She told him to keep his gate and his keys." The revenge itself, the moment when the villain was made small, arrived at a gala, because of course it did. The hospital had decided the best way to deflect a scandal was to bathe the atrium in light and bring out the salmon and dress the board members in tuxedos that fit like forgiveness. The Graham and Sylvia Kincaid Atrium, the plaque read, and I often think now that if they had left her name off, we might have needed more gasoline. But they gave me a match. I wore black. Elena wore the dress she wears when she means to sit with her knees together and her mind open. Margot wore a suit, like a promise. Sloane came in a blue coat because she is practical and kind and worried about the coat check. We stood near a pillar and looked like nothing. The Attorney General's investigator stood near the bar and looked like a man who wishes he could drink before paperwork. The reporter from the Times was there because the hospital cannot resist the camera when it thinks it is telling a story, it wrote. Logan was there too, a guest of the Kincaid family office, and when he saw us, his face did that thing expensive faces do when the warranty turns out to be a rumor. They brought Mr. Kincaid to the podium. He is the kind of handsome the wealthy achieve by force. The hair dyed, not quite the color it remembers, the skin pulled a quarter-inch toward the ears, the teeth that have been told to behave. He spoke in that smooth way that pretends words are money, and as long as you spend enough, you'll never be poor. He said, "Abiding," twice. Sloane's hands shook. I took them in mine and felt the tremor pass to me and then back like the smallest possible storm. When he said family, I stepped forward. It wasn't the plan. That is a lie we all tell after these nights, that it was coordinated down to the second. The plan had been that the investigator would serve papers quietly, and the Times would run a sober A1 the next morning, and the hospital PR would be forced to take and not make. But there is something in me that does not like men in tuxedos saying family into microphones without earning the word. "Excuse me," I said, and microphones are petty men. They prefer the people they already love. Mine had to be given to me by someone who thought I was staff. "Excuse me, Mr. Kincaid," I said again, and this time the room's attention tilted toward me like a wine in a slanted glass. "I came here to thank you," I said, and you could hear two board members' necks crack in unison as they turned. "Because without your abiding generosity, I might have slept another 30 years not knowing the name of the woman who birthed the girl I raised. Without your foundation's careful attention to the way a baby bracelet can be cut and replaced in a hallway at dawn, I might never have met the daughter whose head I kissed only once before someone made her currency." I smiled then, because my mother taught me manners, and because I have learned that a smile is a blade. "So thank you, Mr. Kincaid. Thank you for buying yourself a wing so large your hubris echoed." Someone turned off the violin. The room made that soft, civilized panic sound that only the rich can make. A lawyer started to move, and the investigator, who had been wanting a drink, stepped into the light with the papers in his hand like a man delivering pizza. "Graham Kincaid," he said, "on behalf of the Washington Attorney General's office." He did the thing with the papers that makes TV so satisfying. The flash of a camera, the Times, or maybe a board member who couldn't help himself, stamped a permanent shutter sound across the evening. Sylvia Hart was there, in a dress the color of champagne, and when she saw Sloane, she put her hand to her mouth in that old way of old movies, when a woman has realized the plot included her all along. She did not faint. That impressed me. She sat down. Sloane stood very still. I felt her hand pull on mine, as if we were two women on a bus that had braked hard and we were deciding whether to fall together or apart. The speech Mr. Kincaid hadn't prepared poured out anyway. He said alleged, like it would absolve him. He said misunderstanding. He said difficult, decisions made in difficult times, which is a thing people who have never been poor say when they have been caught. He said the thing they always say in the end, "My family." The room listened as if listening might turn into a vote. "Your family?" I asked, and did not take the microphone back. "They're right here, and the thing about family, Mr. Kincaid, is that you don't get to buy it like custom cabinets. Family is a volunteer position." He looked at Sloane. He looked at Dahlia, who had come because she is brave and because her therapist had said, "You are allowed to be present at your own life." She wore a black suit that fit like resolve. Logan took one step toward her, and she took one step away, and that was the photograph the Times ran. A woman in a black suit stepping away from a man who thought he invented her. The lawsuit wasn't the delicious part. Lawsuits are cold meals. The delicious part was watching the plaque come down 6 weeks later while I drank coffee across the atrium like it was a matinee. The delicious part was the hospital announcing a new protocol for ID bans. the kind of boring fix that prevents tragedies and never makes the news. The delicious part was the check the Kincaid Foundation wrote to the First Light Fund, a newborn safety program Margot and I built out of guilt and paper and coffee, and the way we wrote, "In honor of the mothers who weren't told the truth," on our brochures. The delicious part, too, was small, the way the nurses at Tacoma General began wearing little enamel lighthouse pins. Someone told me Sylvia sent them. Logan tried once more to be the broker of my forgiveness. He asked me to meet him at Mr. West on 5th. He ordered an espresso and a sparkling water and called them expressive and spritz, which is how a man betrays his mother tongue. He said what men always say when they have learned a fresh lesson about consequence, that he was only ever trying to protect. Protect what? I asked. Your ownership stake? He smiled like he thought if he just showed me all his teeth, I'd remember I am an old woman who should be grateful for carried luggage. I know men like Kincaid, he said sympathetically. I know how to channel men like that. I could have shielded her. You couldn't keep a ring on her finger, I said. But I think you'll enjoy talking to your investors about why your name showed up in a records request filed by the Attorney General. He did not finish his spritz. When Dahlia called me Mom again, she did it like the word was expensive, and she wanted to see if she liked how it looked on me before she bought it again. We were in my kitchen. The window was clean, because Sloan had come over 2 days before and cleaned it while telling me about a boy named Tomas in her classroom who lined up pencils like soldiers and could only breathe when they were arranged by height. Mom, she said, and it took me a second to understand I had been called. She smiled a little apologetically, and then not apologetically at all. Is there cinnamon? She asked. I reached for it like a person grabbing a lifeline, and suddenly the mundane felt like an anthem. Oatmeal, spoons, the sound of someone you love using your kitchen the right way. We met Sylvia without cameras. She came to the shop before opening and stood in biography like a woman searching for her own face. She said, "I am sorry," in a tone that made me believe she knew the difference between the apology you give because your lawyer said to, and the apology you give because you wake in the night and your hand is making the shape of a baby's ear. She told me about the man she had been in love with and the man she had married and how bright and dark those rooms were and how she had opened them both to Graham Kincaid and believed their lights would cancel each other. She cried, and I gave her the clean dish towel because paper towels make grief feel temporary. We stood between Hemingway and Hepburn, and we did not flinch when our skirts brushed. "Thank you," she said, "for raising my—" And then she did not say it, because the word was ours. "For raising her," she said instead, and I nodded. "You gave her good hands," I said. "They're steady." When the settlement came through, I gave most of my portion away, because vengeance is a strange fuel. It burns hot, and then you're just standing there, warm and a little raw, and the numbers in your account cannot answer to anything but arithmetic. I kept enough to fix the furnace and to buy a sign for the shop that won't peel in winter. I kept enough to take my daughters, to ocean shores in March, when the beach looks like a line the world draws and erases over and over. We rented a house with a fireplace that smoked like it had never learned manners. We walked in our coats and picked up shells. We said each other's names until our mouths got used to the new geometry. I watched them argue about nothing, milk, a scarf, the proper way to crack a Dungeness, and it was the music of my life rearranged in a key I hadn't known was possible. Margot came too. She stood with me at the edge of the water, and we looked at my daughters pretending they didn't see us looking. "I wanted to tell you then," she said quietly. "I almost took the ferry and knocked on your door and made a mess in your kitchen." "You made a mess in my life," I said, but I said it kindly, because it is a mercy to say true things when there is room for the person you're saying them to stand upright and listen. But you helped me clean it up, and you will spend the rest of your life making sure that every bracelet you ever see is the right one, That's the penance I can allow. She nodded. I look at ankles, she said, and we both laughed without humor. I think I always will. At night, in the little rental, the wind pushed at the windows like a dog who knew there was food inside. Dahlia slept on the couch because she says she sleeps better when she can see the door. Sloane slept in a bedroom with a lamp too bright for a place called a getaway. I lay awake and listened to the old house creak and thought about the way secrets have weight and how we carry them like rocks and how there is a particular lightness when you set down the heaviest one and realize your arms were made for something else. On our last morning, the rain came in sideways and the ocean looked like someone had made it out of tin. We packed up and left the key on the table and drove back towards Seattle through a curtain of gray. As we crossed the Tacoma Narrows, the bridge hummed that low, hollow hum, and I realized something unkind and true. I do not forgive Graham Kincaid. I do not owe him that. What I owe are small, daily adjustments to the shape of the world, the lighthouses in the pockets of nurses, the paperwork filled out with a patience that outlasts stale donuts, the sound of my name when my daughter uses it. When we got back, I opened the shop. A man came in asking for a book about revenge, and I sold him a novel because there is a difference between education and entertainment, and sometimes it's none of my business which he wants. I made a pot of coffee. I taped a flyer for the First Light Fund to the door and straightened it twice because crooked paper aggrieves me as much as injustice used to. I sat at the counter and wrote thank you notes to the clerk on 3rd Avenue and the lab tech on South Lake Union and the nurse at Tacoma General, who couldn't help me, and then did. When I finished, I went to the window and watched Ballard behave like Ballard, a woman in a yellow raincoat with a dog who looks like a loaf of bread, a man on a bicycle who believes the rules do not apply. I am not famous, and the world is not safer because I am loud. But my daughters know their names. The plaque on the atrium has been replaced with the name of a midwife who died 20 years ago, and when I walk through there on my way to the cafeteria, the light looks like it belongs to everyone. People sometimes stop me, now that the story has circulated in the way stories do in a city with too much coffee and too many cameras. They tell me I am brave. I nod. But bravery is just a habit you develop when you have no choice left but to be the person who keeps picking up the phone. On certain nights, when the ferries sound their low horns and the rain hits the window like fingers counting, I hear the soft snap of a plastic bracelet coming undone somewhere in my memory, and I get up and I check, every time, that the names on the women I love still fit them like skin. The end.